complete record of all the observations that are being made.
I would assume that would be the case.
So with that in mind, can we just look, please, at what you say almost but not quite halfway down page 3, and I want to ask you a series of questions about this. I can say that the team observed various men frequent the flat. I am sure that 4 of them were MPs who I recognised as Cyril Smith, Jeremy Thorpe, Leon Brittian and Edward Heath. In relation to Sir Edward Heath, I can say that I saw him inside this flat on more than one occasion, and I'm certain that it was him. I can't say what he was doing inside the premises, nor do I recall how Heath arrived at the flat. Now let me ask you, please, about that. How sure are you, Mr. Sinclair? You've told us about Cyril Smith, but how sure are you about the other names that you have entered in this witness statement in 2017?
At the time I wrote this statement, I was completely convinced that I saw them in the flat or going to the flat, and I still am. I stick with that.
I mean, you seem to say 2 things, and I want to not to be too picky with you, Mr. Sinclair, but just to understand what you're saying. Because in the first line of that paragraph, you say, I can say that the team observed various men. And then you say, I'm sure that 4 of them were MPs who I recognised. So are you saying it's the team who saw these 4 men, or are you saying that you saw and recognised these men with your own eyes during observations?
I saw them and I recognised them, and I can't answer for what the rest of the team would say now. And are you saying that you saw these other 3 well-known men around the same time that you have seen Cyril Smith going into this flat? So around the same period of time? Well, it was the same period of time because we didn't actually the observation didn't go on for all that long.
No, you said it was a few weeks.
You were approached by Barbara Castle, then a very prominent Labour MP in the 1980s, I presume, and
84, yeah.
1984, and she gave you documents and asked you to look into their contents.
That's right, yeah. She was, I was editor of the local paper there. I knew Barbara from several years before. I used to work with the BBC and I'd interviewed her before. And when I went to the newspaper, she became our local Euro MP. So it was a good relationship that continued. We used to meet up quite regularly every Friday and just have a chat about putting the world to rights. And, gradually she came to me and said, I don't suppose you'd be interested in this, and started to feed me some information and bring in some documents. And, it was quite explosive, really, in terms of what she was showing me here. That there was a paedophile ring operating within the powers of Westminster, and that many of the members were actively supporting the PI network, the Paedophile Information Exchange Network. And I find it quite amazing. And she gradually came in with more and more paperwork.
Do we know where she was getting the documents from, though?
Yeah, she got contacted within the House, and they were feeding information to her. She'd obviously been an MP for donkey's years, really, but had sort of left there, quit, and gone as a Euro MP. But she still kept in touch with them, and a lot of her contacts were feeding her really serious information here about people that were meddling in the PI network. The aim really was to try and get enough support within Westminster.
With enormous and enduring gratitude to have had the opportunity to serve the country I love.
To make it legal to have sex with children.
One of the things helpfully you deal with in your statement, paragraph 9, is your knowledge about the Playland arcade investigation.
Yes, sir.
Were you actually involved in that?
I wasn't involved in the evidence gathering. From memory, I think I was involved together with a large number of other officers on what was known as the arrest day, because it was a very, very major operation, as I recall. So I had, if you will, peripheral involvement with it, as far as I remember. Probably in a more detailed way. In terms of when we came on to look at Mr. Twiss in 1978, if you will, the common thread was that one of the team was a constable, Maurice Malin. And Maurice Malin was one of the principal investigators of the Playland. We called it Playland 2 because it'd been an earlier one.
Yes.
He was one of the principal investigators of Playland 2. So in effect, he was the link between the two cases.
And was there any link between Playland 2 and the operations that you and Mr. Sinclair were embarking on in the late 70s?
Well, the intelligence suggested very much so there was a link.
Yeah.
Because in fact there were personalities that stood trial from Playland 1 that ran into Playland 2 and was suggested by the intelligence. I want to be very careful and make the difference between intelligence and evidence.
Sure.
The intelligence strongly suggested from reliable sources that had carried on into the Twiss investigation.
Yeah.
Independent inquiry into child sexual abuse has begun hearings to examine historical allegations of abuse in a children's home and residential school in Rochdale. The inquiry will investigate an alleged failure to prosecute the late MP Cyril Smith. In his opening statement, Brian Altman QC, counsel to the inquiry, said that the hearings were in response to the public concern that some politicians, including Cyril Smith, were involved in child sexual abuse and able to abuse with impunity because they were protected by the establishment. Our Home Affairs correspondent Tom Simons reports.
The child abuse inquiry is planning to go back nearly 60 years and delve into the dark past of two children's homes, this one, Knoll View, and Cambridge House. The claims that children were abused, that staff knew, that no one was brought to justice, and that the scandal was covered up. The larger-than-life Liberal MP Cyril Smith, who died 7 years ago, was a governor of Knoll View.
Do you want a man to represent you, or do you want a party robot?
The claim is that he used his position to get access to children. The first allegations against him date back to 1961. Police investigated, but in 1970 prosecutors said the evidence was stale and his accusers not reliable. By the early 1990s, experts reported growing concerns children were being abused at the Knoll View home. Little action was taken. Last month, finally, Rochdale Council apologised for failing children. Today, the public inquiry will begin taking fresh evidence.
The reason that this matters is we cannot have a situation in this country where powerful people are able to abuse children and can get away with it because other powerful people are protecting them. That cannot be allowed to happen, and that's why we have to investigate what happened with Cyril Smith, and that's why we have to learn the lessons from it.
The inquiry takes evidence like a court but can't prosecute. Its job to discover what happened and who covered it up, and to find ways of preventing it happening again. Tom Simons, BBC News.
Let's speak now to our correspondent Sophie Long, who's at the inquiry. And Sophie, right at the outset, this issue of whether Cyril Smith was protected by others in power, this is right at the forefront of the inquiry.
And if you could repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but.
And nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
So help me God.
First of all, can you give us your full name, please?
My name is David Martin Scott Steele, known in the House of Lords as Lord Steele of Wickwood.
Thank you, Lord Steele. You made a statement to the inquiry, which I'm going to adduce in full, INQ 002748. And perhaps we can put it up on screen. Tell us something about your career in politics, please.
I was elected in a by-election in 1965 as an MP, and have held the seat ever since until I retired in 1997. John Major put me in his dissolution list during the election, so I had no break at all. I served so many years in the Commons and I went straight into the House of Lords.
Yeah. And you went into the House of Lords in
97.
June 87 or 97?
97.
Leader of the Liberal Party between 1976 and 1988.
Correct.
Is that right? Leader of the Lib Dems, March 1988 to July 1988.
Correct.
And you were also a Liberal chief whip in 1970 to 1976.
I think it was 75, but around then, yes. Right. I started after the 70 election.
The first thing I'd like to ask you for your assistance with, Lord Steele, is this. Cyril Smith, really. What did you make of him as a colleague in the Liberal Party?
Well, I listened to the evidence this morning of Des Wilson. I thought he put it very well, that he was a rather Jekyll and Hyde character. I think in my written statement I've told how after the party leadership election, when he had supported my opponent, John Pardo, he said that he wouldn't speak in any constituency that had voted for me.
Yeah.
So that was... he was a sort of prickly character.
Yes. In your third paragraph of your statement, you say he was a difficult colleague. Is that a reasonable statement or an understatement?
I think it was an accurate statement, yes. He was a difficult colleague. He could be quite difficult on a number of issues, yes.
We know he was elected in the by-election in 1972 for Rochdale, but had first been selected as a prospective parliamentary candidate in 1970. And you tell us something about selection panels. I don't need to ask you about that. Did you ever become aware during the period when you were in Parliament and he had become one of your parliamentary colleagues of any historic allegations into child sexual abuse that concerned him?
Not at all, until I read The Private Eye.
We'll come to that in a moment. Had you not even heard that he had been investigated by Lancashire Police?
No.
Between 1969 and 1970, the papers had gone up to the DPP.
I knew nothing about that.
Nothing at all?
No.
So not one of your parliamentary colleagues had ever told you that?
No.
Not even heard it on the grapevine?
No, nothing at all.
Not from any of the whips? No one?
Nothing.
Let's then have a look, please, at the articles. We have them in hard copy, Lord Steele, behind tab 2 in the file that you have, the second tab. But if once you've found that, what I'd like you to do first of all is to go, please, to page 5, because that's the original article, INQ 000963 at page 5.
Yes, Brian Altman is the counsel to the inquiry here. He is still making his opening statement, and he began by explaining that this is not an investigation into the actions of Cyril Smith, but they will of course be central to this. And he said that this investigation will be looking at those two institutions that you heard about in Tom Simon's report. And he began by setting out why this is important, because both those institutions now cease to exist, and many of the people who resided there have passed away, as have some of those accused of abuse. But he said that...
from which the Private Eye article was derivative. So
page
5 within that document.
That's not part of the Private Eye piece.
It's not, because it's the RAP, the Rochdale Alternative Paper article.
Can I just make this point too, that I never saw this Rochdale account until I got these papers. All I went on was the Private Eye story.
All right, well, let's just focus then on the Private Eye story. So we need to go back a single page to page 4. And we had part of this in evidence this morning, but if we focus on about halfway down where the article deals with the allegations.
Can I just make a point before you get that far? I think the first sentence is very important.
Yes.
If I may read it out. There is not an important newspaper or TV station in the land which has not received a copy of the May issue of the Rochdale Alternative Paper. And the reason I say that's important is because of what Des Wilson said this morning, when he said that he had come across at least 2 MPs who had never seen Private Eye.
Yeah.
It's possible that I might not have seen Private Eye, but I happen to be a subscriber to that excellent magazine, and so I had read it. But if I hadn't read it, I wouldn't have known anything about this at all. The Rochdale Observer, although they circulated it to newspapers and so on, they never sent me a copy.
This is not a period of time that became consigned to history. One of those institutions was still admitting pupils until 1994. This is what he said about why this part of the investigation is taking place.
The decision to embark upon this investigation was in part in response to the public concern that some politicians, including Cyril Smith, were involved in child sexual abuse and able to abuse with impunity because they were protected by the establishment. It's only really because of Cyril Smith that the wider issue of child sexual abuse in Rochdale from the 1960s to the 1990s garnered attention.
And I received no enquiries from any paper or any letter or telephone call or anything about it.
But it so happened that you were a subscriber.
Yes.
And because you were a subscriber, Private Eye is what you saw. The article from which it derived, the Rochdale Alternative paper, was something you were completely unaware of.
I've never seen it, yeah.
All right. Let's just look at some of the detail. There's a paragraph which begins, "The first man says," and we had this morning. The first man says that he had missed a day off work. Have you been able to find that?
Yeah, I follow you.
You got that? Good.
Yeah.
The first man says that he'd missed a day off work, which was against the Hostel rules, and he was talking about Cambridge House. He was reported and interviewed by Cyril Smith. His statement goes on, "He gave me the choice between accepting his punishment or leaving the hostel. I said I'd accept his punishment. He took me into the quiet room, told me to take my trousers and pants down and hit me 4 or 5 times with his bare hands on my bare buttocks." The second man's statement says, "Cyril Smith found that I'd taken some money, asked me if I would accept his punishment or be dealt with by the authorities. I said I would accept his punishment. He then told me to take off my trousers and pants and bend over his knee. He trapped my hands between his legs. He hit me many times with his bare hand, and I pleaded with him to stop because he was hurting me. This took place at the hostel. Afterwards, he came to my bedroom and wiped my bare buttocks with a sponge." Another man says, "After a few days, I was given a kind of medical examination by Cyril Smith. He told me to take my trousers and pants down. He held my testicles and told me to cough." And the RAP editors say they have 4 other sworn statements from men who alleged similar spankings or inspections. What the investigation was struck by, however, was the broader picture that emerged by shining a light on Cyril Smith. In other words, it illuminated the day-to-day experiences of children that would have gone unexamined.
So Brian Altman there, the counsel to the inquiry, setting out this part of the inquiry. He told people there that Rochdale affords the panel a rare opportunity to consider how local authorities responded to allegations of abuse of children at the hands of the politicians.
Do you accept, on the face of it, the allegations weren't limited to the spanking of bottoms, but they appear, if accurate, to have included allegations which were far more serious?
Well, I accepted the article as presumably correct, and which is why I questioned Cyril Smith about it.
Right. Now, when you questioned Cyril Smith about it, can you tell us the circumstances in which you did so? We know that these articles were published, the original Rochdale Alternative paper article was published in May. There was a follow-up article in June, but the Private Eye article came hot on the heels, it appears, of the Rochdale Alternative paper article. So when you spoke to Cyril Smith about it, was it around that time, May 1979?
It would have been immediately after the 79 election, I guess.
So around the very same time, May presumably?
Yes.
Yeah. And where did you see him? In your an office in Parliament or in Liberal headquarters?
In the House of Commons.
By appointment or an
No.
meeting?
It was simply a conversation.
He also said that he stressed how important it is for those whose lives have been blighted by these allegations so many years ago, how important it is for them to come here and give evidence, and that's what we will see over the coming 3 weeks. This part of the inquiry will take place over 3 weeks. The inquiry itself due to go on for some years, where it's not due to draw to a close until 2020.
Sophie, thank you. Our correspondent Sophie Long there. And we can, in fact, cross to the inquiry, which is going on in the building behind Sophie, and hear the proceedings which are being provided to us on a slight delay.
Smith states most emphatically that he never behaved in an indecent way towards any of the boys. It's perhaps significant that he didn't avail himself of the opportunity provided to give specific answers to the allegations as they were put to him. Whilst in no way failing to appreciate his dilemma, he had nonetheless been previously supplied with a copy of the boys' complaints. Having regard to his reputation and his undoubted wide experience of affairs, he was most unimpressive during my interview with him. He had difficulty in articulating. And how did the conversation go?
Well, I was afraid you'd ask for that, because 40 years later it's a bit difficult to remember the precise conversation.
Lord Still, nobody's expecting a verbatim account.
No.
But what was the nature of what you said to him?
What I said to him was, "What's all this about you in private eye?"
Yeah.
And he said, rather to my surprise, it is correct,
yeah,
that he had been in charge of, or had some supervisory role in a children's hostel, that he'd been investigated by the police, and that they had taken no further action. And that was the end of the story.
So even the stock replies he proffered could only be obtained after repeated promptings from his solicitor. Were he ever to be placed in the witness box, he would be at the mercy of any competent counsel. And returning to the concern that the Lancashire investigation into Smith had in some way been impeded, it's important to note that Superintendent Leach was unsparing in his view that the allegations were truthful. At the foot of page 13, should we take from that it was a very, very brief discussion?
I think it was fairly brief, yes.
Confrontational?
No, not really. I was just trying to find out whether this was correct or not, and it was.
Now, how did he react to it? Apart from the words that he spoke to you, we've heard something about his character and his size and his intimidatory nature.
I'd just like to repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth. And nothing but the truth.
Sit down, please, Mr. Sinclair. First of all, give us your name, please.
Malcolm Roy Sinclair.
Mr. Sinclair, let me first ask you about your career history in the police force. Where did it start and where did it end?
It started at Rochester Row Police Station in Victoria, Westminster, and I ended up in Paddington.
Yeah. And when did you start? What year?
1966.
And when did you retire?
1994.
And you obviously went in at the lower rank. At what rank did you retire?
An inspector.
A police inspector, uniformed inspector, or a detective inspector?
I did 10 years working. Most of my last 10 years I was working on protection with members of the royal family, and then I was promoted and retired from Paddington Police Station in uniform.
Thank you. Right, Mr. Sinclair, what I really want to get to is a recollection of your time when you were in the club's office in the late 1970s, and You've made a couple of statements. How good is your memory about these events?
It's not as obviously it's not as clear as it was 40 years ago, and now that I'm in my 70s, I must admit that things begin to get a bit hazier.
Yeah.
But quite a lot of it I can remember quite clearly.
What you did know is there were problems around the area of Piccadilly Circus. Is that correct?
That's right.
And was that part of the work that you and your team focused on, something that was known as the meat rack?
Yes.
And what you remembered when you made this statement was that the team was aware of a problem of young runaway boys who would congregate outside Liberties. Is that right?
Yes, but I actually went back up there last night, and it's not actually Liberties. Liberties is up near Carnaby Street.
Well, exactly. That's what
this is at the junction of Lower Regent Street and Piccadilly. It's not actually Liberties. There's another big shop.
Right. Lily White's?
No,
what you were thinking
it's
of?
the other corner.
The other corner.
If you're standing at Lily White's, it's to the left.
Yeah, all right. But it's certainly around the Piccadilly Circus area.
Right in the centre of Piccadilly Circus.
And your recollection was that these boys would wait behind a metal railing in order to be, as it were, selected by men for sexual activity.
That's correct.
You remembered that your tasking, or perhaps a general tasking, was an encouragement to go out and be proactive with your investigations.
Yes.
And what did that mean, being proactive?
Well, you were encouraged to go out and set yourself a task, really.
Yeah.
You weren't sent out and told beforehand what to go and look for.
Yeah. Well, picking up what you say in the statement, you said initially the team observed what took place along the meat rack. I can say that it was clear that young boys, who I can only describe as teenagers, were frequently picked up either by men in cars or walked away from the area with a man. Pausing there, can you give us any assistance, please, with the age of these boys?
Most of them, I would say, were teenagers.
What's the youngest age you encountered?
Well, you would find some under teenagers, but most of them were teenagers.
By which you mean what, preteen?
Yes.
And so these were what, observations on foot of the meat rack by you and your officers?
Yes.
And did you team up or just go off individually? A couple of pairs of you, presumably not in uniform, or were you in uniform?
No, we were in plain clothes.
So plain clothes, and so the impression we get was that you and perhaps a police constable would just walk around and observe what was going on?
That's right. Built up, I think we ended up at one stage of 5 or 6 of us.
And were these foot surveillance operations, or did you use cars?
We were authorised to use private cars that were kitted out with Metropolitan Police radios.
Yeah. What, driving around the Piccadilly Circus area, or was there a particular purpose to the use of cars in surveillance operations like these?
Well, the main reason was to try and house where the people were going to.
And when you say people, who do you mean, the men or the boys? Or both?
Both, if you could.
Yeah.
And the easiest way to try and identify people is to find out their home addresses, and you can check through that way and try and find out a bit more background.
About the men?
Yes.
And did any of these follows lead to arrests of any of these men?
Not through us.
Through whom?
If not through you, then whom? Because obviously, if you mount an operation like this, there has to be an outcome or a purpose to it. And you said that the policy underlying it was in order to follow men, to house them, and then you would find out more about them, who they are. And my question is, did that lead to arrests? And you said not by us. So presumably the information you had was passed on to some unit in order to arrest these men, or not?
Well, it never actually got that far with our inquiry, because we put in a report which wasn't evidential insofar as making arrests was. It was a report that we were satisfied in ourselves that there was an illegal activity taking place.
Is this the flat in Cricklewood?
Yes.
Well, I'll come back to that. Can we park that for the moment? But let's talk about the generality of these kinds of operations, and perhaps men not of public prominence, but ordinary men who were using and exploiting these boys for their own purposes. Can you remember any arrests? Forget people of public prominence, but can you remember any arrests of any of these men based on the operations that you and your team conducted?
Well, not directly, but there was one young lad that was arrested and went to Bow Street.
Well, we'll come to the Amsterdam boy in a while. That's what you're talking about.
Yes.
But I'm not interested in the young lad for the moment. We'll come back to him. I'm talking about men whose activity actually made the meat rack exist and
well,
explained its existence.
People were getting arrested all the time for importuning and picking up young boys.
But not by you?
No.
All right. But which team was doing that then? Or which unit was doing that?
Well, people were getting arrested by uniform officers and everything, because they obviously didn't know. It wasn't common knowledge that we were working in the area.
I see.
So people would be arrested as a daily routine.
Well, effectively under your noses while you were going around your observations?
Yes.
All right. Well, let's come to what you started to tell us about. And I'm simply picking this from the statement you made in 2017. And can we be clear, the statement that you made, it's actually dated the 12th of December 2017. Mr. Kirby from Wiltshire Force, Operation Conifer, told us a statement was taken from you on the 12th of November 2017. I imagine he may have just got the month wrong. But the statement that we have here, was this the statement you made to the Operation Conifer team in Wiltshire?
Yes.
Yeah. And what you had to say at the foot of your page 2 was that on at least one occasion you say you saw, and you say I saw, a chauffeur-driven Cadillac stop on the meat rack and pick up a rent boy. So are you here describing observations made by you personally?
Yes.
And when you say Cadillac, do you mean Cadillac, or are you just using it as a generic term for a kind of limo?
It's what I remember, like a big American car. And it might not have been a Cadillac, but that's what I remember it as.
Right. And you say this happened on a few occasions. And I'm aware that this Cadillac was used by the MP Cyril Smith. How are you aware of that?
Well, I saw him in the car on occasions, and on other occasions it was just driven by his chauffeur. Right. I mean, I never saw Cyril Smith drive that car.
No. Did you know whether Cyril Smith could drive or had a driving license?
I don't know.
You don't know. But he was in an American car of some description, not necessarily a Cadillac, being chauffeur-driven, and on occasions the car was just driving around without anybody in it. Is that what you're telling us?
With the chauffeur.
Now, when you saw the man that you took to be Cyril Smith, first of all, was there any doubt in your mind that it was Cyril Smith as against any other man of a similar description?
No, it was Cyril Smith.
And how can you be sure about that?
Well, I recognised him.
Because he was an MP at the time?
Yes.
And on television? And well known?
Yes.
Right. Did he exhibit any of that to you during the course of this discussion?
Not at all, no.
Had he ever, in any circumstances?
No, I never felt intimidated by him. I was annoyed by him sometimes, but that's another matter.
Did you go into any detail with him? Did you say, well, look, Cyril, we're not just talking about the spanking of bottoms, we're talking about allegations about you holding boys' testicles?
I didn't have the magazine with me, so I wasn't going into the detail. I was just saying I'd read this in the paper.
Yeah.
What had he to say? Now, what I would ask you to remember is that this was 1979. We were talking about an investigation 2 decades previously, when he had been a Labour councillor.
1 decade previously.
Sorry?
It was 1969.
Was it 69?
69.
I thought it was earlier than that.
No, the Lancashire investigation was 1969 to 1970.
I didn't know that. Anyway, it was quite old, but it was certainly before he was an MP and before he was even a member of my party.
Yes.
My point was that he had gone on since then to be Mayor of Rochdale, to be given the MBE for services to local government. Then he joined the Liberal Party. He'd been elected as MP with increasing majorities, I think, 4 times. So I saw no reason or no locus to go back to something that had happened during his time as a councillor in Rochdale.
Why did you raise it with him at all then?
Because I was concerned, having read the thing in private eye. I mean, it seemed quite natural to ask him about it.
What was the concern, that it might be true?
Sorry?
What was the concern, that it might be true?
Yes.
Even despite the fact that there had been an investigation which had come to nothing?
Well, I didn't know that at the time.
So you are, so that we understand you, are you saying that it wasn't even apparent to you, Lord Steele, that he'd been investigated by that time and the DPP had decided not to prosecute?
I don't remember the DPP coming into the conversation at all. It was simply that he had been investigated, that was correct, and no further action had been taken, which I assumed to be a police matter.
Yeah. But my question is, if by the time you were speaking to Cyril Smith about this, you had understood there had been a police investigation which in effect had come to nothing, what was the need for you to speak to him at all?
Well, as I say, all I knew was what was in private eye, and because it was in private eye, it was in the public domain, I thought it was only right to ask him about it.
Well, let's imagine for a moment, and I appreciate that this is a hypothetical situation, but what if Cyril Smith, instead of saying that the article is correct, but it all came to nothing because it was investigated, he actually said, well, I did do these things to those boys. How would you have dealt with it?
Well, he didn't say that to me.
No, but that's why I'm asking you for a hypothetical question. What if he had said it?
As I said in my written statement, my personal opinion is that he was misusing his role as whatever his supervisory role was. He was misusing it.
Well, can I ask you what you did mean? If you've got paragraph 8 of your statement in front of you, please. If you go back, that's behind your first tab. Perhaps we can put it up on screen, please. INQ 002748.
Paragraph 8.
8.
Paragraph 8?
8, please, yes.
Yeah.
You say, I took no further action. This is the 4th line down. I took no further action as the report referred to events before he was even a member of the Liberal Party. It seemed to me that he had possibly exceeded his role as a local Labour councillor. What did you mean by those words?
Well, he claimed that he had been had some supervisory role in the hostel as a councillor,
right,
which entitled him to do these things, which I disagreed with. But still, that was his view.
As you mention it, one of the excuses he was giving you... Are you able to hear me, Lord Steele? All right. One of the excuses he gave you was that as a Labour councillor and having some supervisory or management role within this hostel, he was permitted to, perform medical inspections?
That was the impression he gave, yes.
What was your response to that?
Well, I don't think we went into detail on the individual bits of the private eye story. He just accepted that the story was correct. And obviously I disapproved, but it was, as far as I was concerned, past history.
Was there any policy that the Liberal Party at that time had when accusations of this nature were made, or if such accusations were made, or any accusations made of serious crime against a member of Parliament within the party, how that would be dealt with?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
You say, something you've already indicated, that the club's office team members had their private cars fitted with radios. You've said that already. And we could communicate with each other. We were able to follow this Cadillac, and it drove to a premises near Cricklewood Broadway.
That's correct.
Now, can we just understand what you were saying? Are you saying on the very first occasion that Cyril Smith turned up in this chauffeur-driven American car, the car was followed to the address in Cricklewood, or it was after several occasions when this car turned up that a follow was put on the car and it was followed to this address in Cricklewood Broadway?
It's more likely to be the latter. I can't be sure in my own mind, but all I can say is that we did follow it to Cricklewood Broadway.
And why did you follow this particular car? Was it because you had recognised Cyril Smith, or for any other reason? In other words, is this something that you would have done had it not been Cyril Smith, or was it because it was Cyril Smith?
No, it would have been done anyway, because we'd have tried to see what premises it was going to.
And when you followed the car to Cricklewood Broadway, apart from Cyril Smith, was there anybody else in the car other than the driver?
Not that I can remember.
Well, there had to be a reason why you followed a car to the address.
Well, there was the young boy.
That was my question.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, so there was a young boy that he had selected from the area of Piccadilly Circus, taken into the car, and therefore followed to, ultimately, as you learned it, to be a flat in Cricklewood Broadway.
That's right.
Right. And what you say at the top of your page 3 is that Cyril Smith exited the car at this address with the rent boy. Was there any policy or any safeguarding type of policy at this time in relation to allegations of offences committed towards children?
Well, I don't think it had happened before, so I wasn't aware of it anyway, no.
And we know that no formal inquiry was held.
No.
And that was the end of it.
That was the end of it. As I say, I might not even have read Private Eye, in which case we'd never have heard of it.
But you did?
I did, yes.
And because you did, you had the conversation you've told us about, albeit it was a relatively short conversation. Yeah. Were you prepared to take his word for it?
Yes, well, he didn't deny it.
No.
So, of course, I took his word for it.
Well, he didn't deny the terms of the Private Eye article and the fact that he'd been investigated. But as to whether he had actually committed the offences of which these men were accusing him, was that a topic which ever arose?
I don't think we went into the conversation that deeply, no.
So you came away from that meeting, Lord Steele, not really knowing if he'd committed these offences at all?
Well, I assumed he had, because he said that the account was correct. Why would he have been investigated if he hadn't done something that was possibly wrong?
So you understood that he'd actually committed these offences from what he said to you?
I assumed that.
Right. Wasn't that all the more reason to take matters further and hold some form of inquiry?
No, because it was, as I say, before he was an MP, before he was even a member of my party. It had nothing to do with me.
We heard this morning that there was a formal inquiry launched by the party into Jeremy Thorpe. Was that qualitatively different in any way to...
Yes, because it was current.
It was current?
It was current.
What gave you the confidence, Lord Steele, that if Cyril Smith was confessing to you in 1979 that 10 years or more before he had been assaulting children, that he wasn't continuing to do it on your watch?
Well, he was no longer involved with the children's home, and indeed it had closed down.
You're right about that. But
sorry?
You're right about that. But did you not think that what if Cyril has access to other children, he could be doing this again?
Well, I had no such suspicion or reason to think that.
Had you ever heard of Knollview School?
No.
Where he would allow himself into the premises on occasions and would visit the school, which was a school for boys. Did you appreciate that?
Well, I think that was in the private eye story, wasn't it?
No, it wasn't.
Was it not?
No, but my point is, if Cyril Smith, during this meeting, has admitted to you, in effect, that he was guilty of the accusations, the question arises,
well, we have to be careful about the word guilty, because, of course, he was... no further action was taken.
I'm not using it in the guilty or not guilty sense, Lord Stewart, you understand, but in the sense he's confessing to you that he has committed these acts which have been alleged against him. And I'm seeking to understand from you why that was the end of the matter, you being Liberal Party leader at this point, why you did nothing about it.
Simply because, as I repeat, he was not an MP at the time, he wasn't even a member of my party, so I didn't feel that I had any locus in the matter at all, other than being a reader of the magazine.
Get that, but you understand the points I'm making.
Yes.
He could, for all you knew, still be offending against children.
That never, I had to admit, that never occurred to me, and I'm not sure it would occur to me even today.
Yeah. Now, you say that it was only private eye that you were aware of, and that you hadn't seen the Rochdale alternative paper, but can I ask you about this, please? In the file behind tab 2, and can we put this up on the screen? I'm not sure if...
Which tab is it?
Tab 2, please. And if you go to the 6th page, you'll see 006. In the bottom right-hand corner, INQ 000963, page 6.
Yeah, I got it. With the photograph of Cyril Smith on it. Yeah.
That's the one. I'm not sure we're able to bring up the... ideally, we would have pages 2 and 3 together. But you'll know what I'm about to ask you, Lord Steele. There's a quotation which begins just under the photograph.
Under the photograph?
Yeah. I have to read across to the 3rd page, which isn't up on screen, and I don't think we can do a split screen. But the way it reads is, it's a quotation, and you have been asked about this before. It's not a very friendly gesture publishing that. All he seems to have done is spanked a few bare bottoms, and the quotation is attributed to David Steele's press office, the 22nd of April 1979.
Well, the first thing to say is that I'm afraid I didn't have the luxury of a press officer, so no. It was the party press office.
Yeah.
And he may well have said that, I don't know.
Would it be something that you would have approved?
Well, that's a hypothetical question. I don't think it was ever discussed. So, in fact, I'm sure it was never discussed, because I would remember if anyone had mentioned it.
The date of it is the 22nd of April. And if the date is accurate, and the publication date for this Rochdale Alternative Paper article is also accurate...
This was coming out during the election, then?
Well, it predated. The quotation... Yeah. Is alleged to have predated, or is said to have predated, the publication date of the RAP article.
Right.
You'll see it's in quotation marks.
Yeah.
So it suggests, the internal logic of it is, it suggests that somebody gave that quotation to the RAP. And it suggests also, I understand that you say you didn't have a personal press officer, but it was a party officer. Do you think, as leader of the Liberal Party at the time, that anyone in that office would have put out a statement of that nature without your approval to it?
Oh yes, that's perfectly possible, and in fact I'm sure that's what happened, because I would have heard about it, but if it was the 12th of April, that would have been actually during the election.
22nd of April.
Well, even more the 22nd of April. I forget what the date of the election was, but it would certainly have been running at that time.
Yeah.
I would have been up in Scotland. I was nowhere near the party headquarters.
Right. So we should understand that somebody was willing to put out a press statement which was...
Well, was it a press statement, or was it an answer to a query from the paper?
I can't tell you.
No, but I suspect from the look of it, it was the paper ringing up party headquarters and getting this comment from a press officer.
A bit of a silly thing to have said, though, don't you agree?
Quite possibly, yes, yes.
The page that we should be on.
Well, that is from the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse. And if you want to continue watching proceedings, you can do so on the inquiry's website, which is streaming proceedings live with a slight delay.
In his first public hearings into historic allegations of abuse in Rochdale, the inquiry was told the Prime Minister at the time, Margaret Thatcher, was aware of the claims against the MP when she approved his knighthood. Our Home Affairs correspondent Tom Simons reports.
In the 1960s, they called him Mr. Rochdale. He became mayor of the town for Labour, but defected to the Liberals, the forerunners of today's Liberal Democrats.
Do you want a man to represent you, or do you want a party robot?
But in the 60s, it was never revealed that he'd been accused of sexually abusing deprived boys. After nearly 6 decades, what started as rumour and innuendo has led to this. 3 weeks of public hearings at the child abuse inquiry to finally get to the bottom of it.
The decision to embark upon this investigation was in part in response to the public concern that some politicians, including Cyril Smith, were involved in child sexual abuse and able to abuse with impunity because they were protected by the establishment.
It's claimed Cyril Smith later abused boys at this school for troubled children, but in 1970 police were investigating allegations about him at a hostel for young men, Cambridge House, when he came to see them. A transcript of the meeting records a police officer saying,
"You want to see what we know?" And Smith started laughing at that. "Well, yes, fishing. I think that's fair comment."
Fishing because Cyril Smith was hoping to move from local politics to national. He told the police,
"In 3 weeks' time, I've got to give a decision, one way or another, whether I'm going to fight the next parliamentary election as a Liberal in Rochdale. And if I'm going to be charged, I'm not going to accept. Guilty or not guilty, it would be unfair to the party."
He wasn't charged. Years later, the press started to get wind of the investigation that had taken place, and now the inquiry's found new evidence of a cover-up.
This inquiry made a request to MI5, the security service, to see if it had any information that was relevant to this investigation.
It did. Secret files from MI5's archives suggest in 1979 prosecutors lied to journalists and denied Smith had been investigated.
Smith was re-elected in greater numbers than before, and far from diminishing him, the allegations appear to have had absolutely no effect whatsoever.
Cyril Smith will be at the centre of these 3 weeks of hearings, but the allegations are much wider, that paedophiles had easy access to children in Rochdale and that it was covered up.
Now, the child sex abuse inquiry has heard that prosecutors lied to the press in 1979 about the existence of serious allegations against the Liberal MP, Sir Cyril Smith. The inquiry heard that officers who had been investigating claims that he abused teenage boys in Rochdale had decided there was a case, but prosecutors decided not to take any action. Our Home Affairs correspondent Tom Simons has the details.
The inquiries obtained these documents held by the security service MI5, which record that the Director of Public Prosecution's press representative had untruthfully told Bartlett, a journalist, that they had no record of this case.
Smith was re-elected in greater numbers than before, and far from diminishing him, the allegations appear to have had absolutely no effect whatsoever.
Also under investigation, the rife sexual abuse linked to this residential school, Knoll View, where Smith was a governor. At one point, a sex offender roamed its corridors at night. But as with Cyril Smith, the central allegation is of a cover-up. This inquiry is attempting to learn the lessons of the past so that children can be better protected in future. Tom Simons, BBC News, at the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse.
A silly thing to have said, not least on its own terms, but also because anybody looking at this would think it had the leader of the Liberal Party's approval.
Yes. I see what you mean, yeah.
But it rather trivialises what these young men had alleged. And not only does it trivialise it...
Well, of course, we don't know what he was being told. Presumably this was over the telephone.
What one might assume, but at the same time, it's a trivialisation of spanking of bare bottoms when we know that the allegations were far more serious. It's the cupping of boys' testicles and that kind of activity. But was it the early hours?
I'd have thought it was the evening.
Evening or early hours?
Well, I think it was in the evening.
And the age of the boy, can you tell us anything about that?
No, I've just got him down as a rent boy, so I would take it a teenager.
Yeah. And what you then say is you had a specific memory of looking up to the lights on in the flat and seeing Smith inside. From your position, you say, I was not able to see what took place inside, but from memory, I'm fairly certain that both Smith and the rent boy were inside.
That's correct.
All right. But what happens then? Do you keep observation on the flat or just leave it, having made those observations?
Well, the flat was kept under observation.
By you or by another officer?
There was a static observation on the flat most of the time.
And static, by which you mean obviously non-mobile, but static in a car or on foot?
I think that Paul Holmes was in another premises.
In another premises?
I think so.
So I suppose after all these years, it doesn't matter if I ask you whether there was an observation post?
Yes.
Right. But that could only have been set up after the first occasion that the flat was identified?
That's right.
Yeah. And so there were continued observations on this flat, presumably, because it started to have interest for your unit.
That's correct.
Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
On the first occasion, though, that Cyril Smith was followed to the flat, which I understand you to be telling us you were directly involved in, was the flat kept under observation to see where Cyril Smith went or what happened to the boy?
I can't remember.
Is it possible or not?
It is possible, but I can't remember.
You then say that you remembered the team undertaking observations on this particular flat in Cricklewood. So that's really what you're telling us, without having spelled it out, that there must have been some static observation post somewhere in the area. And you say it must have been that there was a degree of activity from this flat on a few occasions to warrant such action. In other words, in order to set up a static observation post, the intelligence from the flat had to warrant it, because it has resource issues and other issues.
Yes.
In order to set up an observation post in those days, would you have to have sought authorization from a more senior officer?
Again, I can't remember the ins and outs of that. I don't think we did. I think we did it ourselves, but I wouldn't like to be held to that.
All right. I recall you say that when the team came on duty, one officer was allocated the role of observing the flat, whilst other team members were on the road paying attention to the meat rack. So what you're saying is you've got observations on the flat, observations on the meat rack, and presumably you were seeing if there was any link between the two.
That's correct.
You thought that the whole thing, this series of observations, must have taken place over a number of weeks, although you couldn't be certain about the length of time.
That's right.
And I want to ask you now, please, Mr. Sinclair, about what follows, please, in the next paragraph. But before I do, can we understand something else about observations even in those days? Would there have been a logist logging the observations either at the meat rack or at the flat? In other words, somebody who's
I would have thought there would have been at the flat, and I think that most of the time that was Paul Holmes.
So we should imagine Paul Holmes sitting in an address.
Yes.
Observing the comings and goings at this flat and writing down on a log sheet
or a series of log sheets what he sees and who he sees, and the times of those observations.
That's right. I mean, one of the things that impressed me about Paul Holmes was he had a photographic memory, and he would log people down, and he would have nicknames or letters of the alphabet or something, and identify people.
And that's because surveillance logs back then, but over the years, typically tend not to use actual names. Sometimes you don't know the names or the identities of the targets that you're observing, so there are either given target code names or nicknames. What was used for Cyril Smith?
I've got no idea. No.
But you assume that if Paul Holmes had seen Cyril Smith, he would have written either a code name for him, which he would have attributed to him, or some other nickname.
Yes.
And that would have been used throughout. And somewhere within the unit, probably not on the surveillance logs, there would be a code list of X means Cyril Smith, Y means someone else, and so on and so forth.
Yes.
Would logs typically have been kept for the mobile surveillance? Would there be, for example, a driver and the chap sitting on in the front driver's seat with a clipboard on his lap with a series of log sheets doing the same sort of thing?
Not as much, no, because a lot of the time, as far as I can remember, a lot of the time I was on my own in the car.
Right. Well, would you be radioing? Would there be if there was a team of, let's say, 4 of you, some of you observing the meat rack, some of you observing the flat, would there be a single logist and everybody radioing in their observations, and he would log others' observations? Would that?
Well, we would speak to the static observation posts, let them know that we were on the move, and they would log that. And
if you'd observed anything, for example, car on the move, presumably the logist in the static observation post would be logging what you're radioing in, so that you have a complete record of all the observations that are being made.
I would assume that would be the case.
So with that in mind, can we just look, please, at what you say, almost but not quite, halfway down page 3, and I want to ask you a series of questions about this. I can say that the team observed various men frequent the flat. I am sure that 4 of them were MPs who I recognised as Cyril Smith, Jeremy Thorpe, Leon Brittian, and Edward Heath. In relation to Sir Edward Heath, I can say that I saw him inside this flat on more than one occasion, and I'm certain that it was him. I can't say what he was doing inside the premises, nor do I recall how Heath arrived at the flat. Now let me ask you, please, about that. How sure are you, Mr. Sinclair? You've told us about Cyril Smith, but how sure are you about the other names that you have entered in this witness statement in 2017?
At the time I wrote this statement, I was completely convinced that I saw them in the flat or going to the flat, and I still am. I stick with that.
I mean, you seem to say 2 things, and I want to not to be too picky with you, Mr. Sinclair, but just to understand what you're saying. Because in the first line of that paragraph, you say, I can say that the team observed various men, and then you say, I'm sure that 4 of them were MPs who I recognised. So are you saying it's the team who saw these 4 men, or are you saying that you saw and recognised these men with your own eyes during observations?
I saw them and I recognised them, and I can't answer for what the rest of the team would say now.
No. And are you saying that you saw these other 3 well-known men around the same time that you have seen Cyril Smith going into this flat? So around the same period of time?
Well, it was the same period of time, because we didn't actually the observation didn't go on for all that long.
No, you said it was a few weeks.
Yes.
Or a number of weeks.
Yes.
Are you saying that these men were seen entering this flat on separate occasions or entering the flat at the same time as each other?
I can't say.
Is it something you're likely to forget, Mr. Sinclair? I know it's a long time ago.
Well, I cannot say whether they went in together or separately. I just can't remember. It's something that I've talked about over the years in my own home, and it was something that kept coming up. But I can't actually remember the details of them getting there.
If you look at the next sentence beginning, I cannot recall.
Yes.
I cannot recall if the team ever checked out who owned or rented this particular flat. Is that right? Is that right? You in 2017 you couldn't recall?
I couldn't in 2017, no.
But then you add, but Cyril Smith definitely went there with little boys. Do you not think, and I'm not criticising, but I'm just seeing how far we go with your recollection, Mr. Sinclair, do you not think that the way that that sentence is crafted, but Cyril Smith definitely went there with little boys, without you naming Jeremy Thorpe, Leon Brittian and Edward Heath, rather suggests that you were less than certain about the three other men?
No, I'm sure I saw them there.
So why does that sentence read like that?
I don't actually understand the point you're trying to make about the sentence.
The sentence says, I can't recall if the team ever checked out who owned or rented this particular flat, but Cyril Smith definitely went there with little boys. You don't say the same about the other three men. Their names don't appear in that sentence.
I never saw them go in there with little boys.
So that's the distinction?
Yes.
So when you saw them, they just turned up?
They went to the flat, yes.
As far as you can say, their attendance there, if you did see them, was entirely innocent?
It could have been, yes.
You've already said that Paul Holmes, who was of great assistance to you when you joined the club's unit, had a photographic memory.
Yes.
You told us that. And you had made available to you material, in particular a lengthy statement that Paul Holmes himself wrote to, I anticipate, Operation Conifer, at least notes of interview, and a statement he made to this inquiry. Have you seen those?
Yes.
Have you had time to absorb what he said?
Yes.
Do you agree that one of the things he said, given that he has a photographic memory, was that he was unable to name or identify any possible offender by name in relation to that flat?
I read that.
And what do you say about that?
Well, he obviously can't remember. It is 40 years ago.
Do you think, being realistic, Mr. Sinclair, that if you had seen Cyril Smith and or Jeremy Thorpe and or Leon Brittian and or Edward Heath going into that flat, you're going to forget it? Especially if you have a photographic memory.
I wouldn't have thought so.
You wouldn't?
No.
Any explanation? You see why I'm asking you, don't you? I mean, Paul Holmes has no recollection whatsoever of any of the names that you mention entering the flat, but the name he does remember is the person whose flat it was. But you don't, do you?
Well, having read his statement, I do.
You do now, maybe, having read his statement, but do you accept the name Rodham Twiss, whose flat it was, is a name that doesn't appear in anything that you've said in the past?
That's right.
So whereas you mention the name of 4 well-known parliamentarians of various periods, you don't mention the very name of the person who was the target of this operation, Rodham Twiss, whose flat, the Cricklewood Broadway flat, was. Whereas Paul Holmes, with the photographic memory, remembers the target of the operation, Rodham Twiss, but makes no mention whatsoever of the 4 well-known parliamentarians that you mention. And you can see the problem, can't you?
Yes.
Yeah. Can you explain it?
No, I can't. All I can explain is the length of time and memory.
But despite this, you still maintain that you saw the 4 men that you've named?
Yes.
In relation to that flat, and Cyril Smith in a chauffeur-driven car in Piccadilly Circus?
Yes.
On several occasions?
Yes.
Because as you've said in the statements I've just invited your attention to, I can't recall if the team ever checked out who owned or rented this particular flat. Well, it was Rodham Twiss. But do you remember now anything about Rodham Twiss or the difficulties that Mr. Holmes had in particular in finding out any information about him, in particular the fact that he'd been convicted of an offence of abuse as long ago as 1967, so at least 10 years before your operation, but you couldn't find that out. Do you remember any of that?
Yeah, I do now that I've read that.
But when you came to make your statement to Operation Conifer, you couldn't even remember that this was all about Twiss?
No.
No. Can I move on, please? Because then you remember having concerns about young boys being brought over from Amsterdam to the meat rack area. And you say as a result the team arranged for a young boy from the Piccadilly meat rack to be sent over to Amsterdam. And you say, I can't be certain who would have authorised this activity, but it may have been the Chief Superintendent Neil Diver. And we've spoken about him already. He was the Chief Superintendent in overall command. You say the same boy then appeared back in the London area a few days later. This confirmed the team's suspicion that there must be a connection between the two cities. I'm unable to recall the name of this boy, but I do remember attending Bow Street Magistrates Court on 2 occasions to represent the boy's welfare. I believe we kept him from being sent to prison. I remember that the boy was arrested twice in 1 month, but it's unlikely these records would still exist. Now, tell us a little more about this. There was a boy who was identified as having come from Holland. A runaway, was he, who attended the meat rack?
Well, I think all the boys involved were UK boys, but there seemed to be quite a go between London and Amsterdam, and the suggestion was that vulnerable young boys who were in Amsterdam were being brought over to the meat rack in London.
So are you saying that young boys were either finding their own way here, or were they being trafficked?
Well, we felt they were being trafficked or brought over, and that was the idea. That we got to know this young lad, and
how did you get to know him?
Just by talking to them on the meat rack.
Right. And when you talked to them, while we have it in mind, did you try to, as it were, not only do a welfare check on them, but try to prevent them staying there and to get them away from that area? What did you do?
Well, I think the object we had in mind at this time was to try and find out what was happening and how they were coming back from Amsterdam. And some way or other, and I can't remember how, we got him to go to Amsterdam, and he appeared back in no time, but
You mean return home?
No, return back to the meat rack.
No, I know that, but when you say you've got him to go back to Amsterdam, so you persuaded him to go home again. Is that what you did the first time? And then but he came back again.
He came back again.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I think it was uniform officers arrested him on 2 occasions when we were doing our observation.
Arrested for what?
Importunity.
And what became of him then?
Well, he appeared at Bow Street Court, and I went along to try and look after his welfare, basically.
Right. How old was he?